This is why we always have those videos that play in between all the things. You don't have to watch us stumble around up here, try to get things figured out. There we go. Man, it is good to be together today. I had to actually step outside right after the service started. I think it's going to be a beautiful one, so thank you so much for prioritizing worship and for being with us this morning. If you have a Bible with you this morning, we are going to start out in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 in just a moment. Before we get into that, let me explain the next couple weeks are standalones. So that just means it's not a part of a sermon series. We just got done with a series called Heroic. That was a 4-week series that we started the year with, and I really love to preach in sermon series, but usually as we plan out where we're going to go and what we're going to talk about, I like to leave a little bit of flexible space for ideas that maybe don't quite fit in somewhere else, and just really pray that the Lord would lead us in those standalones for what feels right and appropriate in the moment. And as I have been starting off 2023 and doing the work of sermon prep for that heroic series, these two words that are on the screen, I just couldn't shake them. I just kept thinking about these words, faithful and fruitful. And if you look at this picture, it probably, I don't know, it looks like a weird like garlic knot or something, but it's actually a picture of a handshake. And this has been the picture that's been stuck in my mind is a handshake between faithful and fruitful. Hopefully that'll make a little more sense by the time we get to the end of this message today. Yesterday was Brady's birthday. He loves to be the center of attention, so if we could all turn around and clap and sing. I'm just kidding, don't do that. He actually likes, no. Okay, there we go. We love you, Brady. I apologize. You can give me a hard time about that later on when we get home, which he will. So that'll be great. But anyways, because it was his birthday, we decided, hey, let's get Chick-fil-A for breakfast. So I went to Chick-fil-A, and I had this big old bag of Chick-fil-A. He's a sleeper-inner, so we didn't want to do that early. We actually waited until Chick-fil-A was almost done serving breakfast, and I went and got some chicken minis. And so I was coming back home, pulling in my driveway with my chicken minis, and my neighbor was in his driveway. And it looks like he had just gotten back from something as well. And he kind of stood there and waited for me to get out. And when I got out of the Jeep, he had this big smile on his face. He goes, "Hey, man, did you just get back from working out too?" And I went, "No, man, I just got back from Chick-fil-A." And I felt like we had very different mornings. You know, we were doing very different things, and it just struck me as really funny. Like, I don't know if he knew that there was a 0% chance that I had just gotten back from working out. I started thinking about how many times I've gone to the gym since we moved to Conway, Arkansas. Anybody want to guess what that number might be? 0. That's exactly right. 0 times. Now, I'm not saying I haven't done any exercise, but to go to a gym and lift weights, that's about the least appealing thing in the universe for me. Like, if Nicole was like, "Hey, Tim, would you like to stay at home and clean or go to the gym and work out?" I would be like, "What would you like for me to clean here right now, honey?" Like, anything except for, anyone go to the dentist and have a tooth extraction or work out? Like, I might have to think about that one for a minute. But I thought about Bo, my neighbor, in his driveway, asking me if I was coming back from the gym, and it made me laugh because a year or 2 years ago, it would have been a different situation. I wouldn't have been coming back from the gym, but it wouldn't have been at all unusual. But I would have got up before the sunrise, gotten out on a bike ride and rode 40 or 60 or maybe even 80 miles, come rolling back into my driveway, kind of tired and energized at the same time, and seen Bo over there in his driveway. Bo was really out of shape, and he would be like, "Hey, man, how was your ride?" And I was like, "It was awesome. You should go with us sometime. You need to get a bike and some stretchy pants, and you can join us." And he had no interest in that. But he did get to the place where he realized that his health was kind of getting out of control, and he started going to the gym, just like a year ago. Started going to the gym all the time, and the Bo that was standing in his driveway yesterday looks nothing like the Bo that was standing in his driveway a year ago. In fact, I saw him later in the day. I got back from a drive with Brady, who has his permit and is working towards his license, and Bo saw me pull into the driveway, and he goes, "Oh, man, that's some scary stuff." And he didn't say stuff, but that's the church version, right? And I was like, "Bo, you're absolutely right." And we had a little conversation, and I was like, "Hey, man, I was thinking about you asking me if I went to the gym this morning. Can I tell this story? Because here's what I believe. I think everybody wants the kind of results that you've gotten over the last year, but not everybody wants to do the kind of work that you've put in to get there. We have this tendency in our lives to see the fruit, and we want the fruit, but we forget about the faithfulness that it takes to get to the point of fruitfulness. And Bo was actually like, he was kind of honored, and he was like, yeah, man, I would love that. That'd be great. You're welcome to tell my story. He's like, I just put a before and after picture on Facebook a couple of days, so this screen doesn't usually do anybody justice, but this is my neighbor, Bo. I don't know how much weight he's lost. Probably not that much, because he's just ripped like an animal now. Like, he's so, he goes to the gym a lot. And so we were talking, and I was like, yeah, man, how often do you go? He goes, I go every day. He goes, I was at the gym for 4 hours today. And I was like, yeah, that actually sounds more like a problem than a good thing, Bo. I don't know. And so he was telling me all about his lifting strategy and all those things. And I said the same thing to him. I was like, man, everybody wants the results that you've gotten, but not everybody wants to do the kind of work that it takes to get those results. Isn't that true in life, that we all want the fruitfulness, but we don't always want the faithfulness that it takes to get to the point of fruitfulness? I think about Bo in the small investments that he's made every day over the last year as he's changed his diet and he's started lifting weights and working out, and it's had a transformational change in his body. And I think we understand this when it comes to like just kind of things in the world, to fitness. If I want to be healthy or I want to get more fit, yeah, I need to eat fewer calories. I need to burn more calories. I need to get moving. I need to get active, and I'll start to see the changes. And if I just keep doing that over and over and over again, eventually I'll get to the place where there's a difference. We know that if we just continue to have kind of sedentary lives where we're not active and we just eat whatever we want, like that's not gonna end well. Like we kind of understand the same thing financially. Like some of us have maybe accumulated some debt, and we're like, man, I really want to get rid of that debt. And we know, like, if I want to get rid of the debt, I need to make a budget, and I need to be intentional about saving, and I need to get really intentional about telling my money where it needs to go so that I can pay that down. And maybe I even need to earn some extra money so that I can eliminate some debt. And we start to establish some habits and some practices to drive down that debt in our life. And we know, like, if I want those kind of results, I have to do these kind of small things all along the way. But for some reason, we don't always correlate that to our spiritual lives. Like what works in the real world is one thing, but what works in the spiritual world at a soul level for us, I think is kind of the same. Like if we think about the lives that we really want to live, kind of in overflow from this hero, we think about the story we want to tell with our lives. We think about, I talked about last week, as the credits roll on our life, who we want to be, what we want to accomplish, how we want to have lived. We want to have lives where we've lived long, full lives that are healthy. We want to live lives where we have financial freedom and we're able to be generous and be a blessing to others. We want to come to the end of our life and we want to have healthy and strong relationships where we know that we've poured our life into some other people, and there's a celebration of the life that we've lived, but there's also a sadness that presence isn't going to be in their life anymore. We think about the people that we want to become, that we think God is calling us to be, and I mean, we're talking about fruitfulness, so you go Galatians chapter 5, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Like, if we ask, man, do you want to be the man that God has created you to be? Do you want to be the woman that God has created you to be? Absolutely, we all want that. But then when it gets to the question of if you want to get the fruit, are you willing to do the work of being faithful? It's just not as exciting. And the Bible talks about reaping and sowing and faithfulness and fruitfulness. Like, this is a theme that's mentioned over and over again in the Bible. And I just started to look at some of these verses, like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 through 9. It's kind of maybe a weird one to pick. I hope you can see this font that I've selected. This is Paul talking to the church in Corinth, the church that he started, and then another guy named Apollos came and poured his life into. They're arguing about whether people came to faith under the ministry of Paul or this other guy Apollos, and he says, I planted the seed, and Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor, for we are co-laborers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. I thought about this description that Paul gives where he says, man, I planted the seed and Apollos watered the seed, but it was God that made it grow. Here's what Paul's saying. He says, God called me to do something, and I was faithful to do it. He called me to plant the seed, to start the work, so I did what God called me to do. I was faithful in it. And after I was faithful with what God called me to do, there's another man, Apollos, and God called Apollos to come in and to nurture it, to cultivate that soil, to work on it, to make sure that it was healthy so that something could grow there. And Apollos did what God called him to do. I was faithful to do what God called me to do. Apollos was faithful to do what God called him to do, and now you're arguing about the faithfulness of Paul and the faithfulness of Apollos. He says neither one of those things matter. We are all supposed to be faithful to what God has called us to do. All I did was be faithful to plant the seed that God called me to plant. And all Apollos did was he was faithful to water the seed that God called him to water. But I didn't make the seed grow, and Apollos didn't make the seed grow. It was God that made the seed grow. And now here's the crazy thing. You can't see the work that Paul did, and while Apollos is doing his thing, you're not really sure if it's going to be fruitful and it's going to be effective, because God calls us to be faithful. That is our work, that is our calling, and that is our job. But God's job is to make fruitful things from faithful things. Like everybody wants to be fruitful, but we struggle sometimes with the faithful side of things. When the promise from God is, if you will be faithful, I will make you fruitful. The tricky thing is, you don't decide if what God calls you to do is fruitful or not. You don't get to pick when the harvest comes in and when the fruit is seen. The only part of the process that you have control of when it comes to the work of God is His calling to you to be faithful and obedient in small things consistently. And when you're faithful and obedient to the small things that He calls you to do consistently, eventually, if you trust Him and you don't give up, eventually that leads to fruit in your life. You don't make anything fruitful. Faithful is on you, and fruitful is on Him. And here for my note takers, I don't think I put a slide in on this, but for my note takers, fruitfulness is a byproduct of faithfulness. I'll say it again. Fruitfulness is a byproduct of faithfulness, and it's a crock pot, it's not a microwave. It's a slow cooker, it's not an Instapot. I'm sorry, Rosemary, I know you love the Instapot, but it takes time, right? I'm going to try to work you in every sermon this year. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. It's a slow process. And we're not great with slow because we want fast, because we live in a fast-paced world. But fruitfulness is a byproduct of faithfulness, and faithfulness is actually what God calls you to. And if you will do what God calls you to do, He will do what He promises that He will do. Church, do we believe that God is faithful? There's a verse in 1 Timothy that says, even when we're unfaithful, God is faithful. It's just who He is. That like He doesn't get to change, He doesn't get to pick that. He doesn't waver on that. God is faithful. You read through Scripture, you see it over and over and over again, that the story of God is the story of His faithfulness to unfaithful people. But He doesn't always make unfaithful people fruitful. He makes those who are faithful fruitful. And I know I go to John 15 a lot, but these verses came up for me. I love it in the King James Version, and I updated it just a little bit with the New King James Version, where He just says, "Abide in me." If you read a more recent translation like the NIV or maybe the New Living Translation, it's probably going to say, "Remain in me, abide in me, and I in you." As a branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. And he who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. And I started thinking about this idea that fruitfulness is just a byproduct of faithfulness, and we all want to be fruitful, but if we want to be fruitful, the path towards that is to be faithful so that God can make us fruitful. And I wondered what would happen if we stopped looking at the finish line results in the big marquee thing that we want to accomplish. And we realize that big thing that we want to accomplish, it's not just about the finish line, it's about faithfulness from the very beginning all the way to the end, trusting in the faithfulness and goodness of God that if He promises He will make it fruitful, He will do that in His time. And I thought about these verses from John 15, where we're told over and over and over again, abide in me, remain in me, dwell in me, live in me, stay connected to me. And for me, I think that abiding is about faithfulness. When He says, abide in me, remain in me, stay in me, be faithful to me. As a fruit cannot bear fruit of itself unless it is faithful, neither can you unless you are faithful to me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who is faithful bears much fruit. If you are unfaithful, you can do nothing. In those words, I think that translation, I think it breaks down and it applies to our life. That we've seen that at work before. That when I'm faithful to Him, when I'm consistent with the small things, when I spend my life deeply connected to the life source that is the vine, the natural byproduct of life connected to the vine, the natural byproduct of a faithful life is that faithful life produces fruit, improves to be faithful. But a life that's disconnected from a life source, a life that's independent and unfaithful to what God has called us to be faithful to, that is not the kind of life that He can bless. That's not the kind of life that produces fruit. And some of us look at fruitlessness in our life and we're thinking, man, I wonder what I got to do to see more fruit in my life, more fruit in my relationships, more fruit with my family, more fruit at work, more fruit at church, whatever it is. And the answer to how do I get more fruit is more faithfulness. Be more faithful. Be more deeply connected, more deeply surrendered, more deeply and desperately dependent on the life-giving source that comes from Him, that we experience when we live the lives that He's called us to live, becoming the people who He created us to be, living lives of faithfulness. Abide in me. Remain in me. Here's what I believe. I believe that faithfulness cultivates the soil of our lives so that we can be fruitful in the proper season. Do you want me to say that again? Faithfulness cultivates the soil of our lives so that we can be fruitful in the proper season, and I would add by His strength. And He decides when the proper season is, and the fruit comes not by my strength and my efforts, but it comes through my surrender and my faithfulness, so that by His strength in His time I experience the fruitfulness. Faithfulness cultivates the soil of my life so I can be fruitful in His time. Look at the parable of the sower. Parable of the sower, super familiar. Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 13, Jesus is talking. And He says, the same day Jesus went out of the house, and He sat by a lake, and such a large crowd gathered around Him that He got into the boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore, and He told them many things in parables. A farmer went out to sow seed, He said. And as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came down and ate it, the path. Some fell on rocky places where they did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. And other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked out the plants, and still others fell on good soil, where it produced a good crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let him hear. We hear about those soils, right? You got the path, you got the rocks, you got the weeds, you got that shallow soil. And all of us here, I'm just guessing, if you're at church on a beautiful day in February in Arkansas, like if you showed up today, you want to be good soil, right? All of us want to be good soil. And then the question becomes, how do I cultivate the soil in my life so that I'm not shallow and I don't have any roots? In fact, if you go back and you look at the context of this verse from 1 Corinthians that we started with, that's actually what he's talking to them about, is about spiritual shallowness that they have. He's like, man, you guys should be ready for spiritual food, and I still have to give you milk because you haven't grown. You don't have roots. We don't want to be shallow. We don't want our hearts to be hard to God. We don't want to have so many other things competing for our attention and our allegiance and our love for Him that when something good tries to grow out of our life, it's just twisted and strangled and choked out by all that other stuff, all the other idols, all the other distractions, all the other priorities in our life. We don't want that. We want deep, rich, fertile soil in our life. And then the question is, yeah, Pastor Tim, we all want that, but not all of us experience that. And so why is it that even for some of us who are following Jesus and we want that fertile soil, why am I not experiencing that? And I would say that faithfulness cultivates the fertile soil of our lives so that we can be fruitful in His timing, in His season. Faithfulness leads to the fertile soil. We look at the harvest, and we all want the harvest, but what we've got to remember is a lot of work went into that. A lot of daily, intentional, purposeful work goes into producing that kind of harvest. The farmer goes out before seeds are ever planted, and they till the soil, they work the soil, they make sure that the soil is fertile and it's ready to receive the seed. And then when they go out, they do scatter that seed like he's talking about. I mean, the picture is of a farmer, and he's just throwing the seed, but he's aiming for the fertile soil, right? He's like, I want to have a good return on this. I'm going to make sure that it's going to land somewhere so that what I plant has an opportunity to flourish and to grow. What would happen if we lived our lives so faithfully to God that when He looked at the places where seeds could be planted that would produce fruitfulness down the road, what would happen if He looked at our habits and our priorities and our practices and the rhythms of our lives? What would happen if he looked at our character that's being shaped through the way that we love Him and we pursue Him, and He looked at the way that we spend our time and our resources? If He could look at us and He would say, man, that's someone who's faithful. And because that someone is faithful, that soil is going to be fertile. And I know that if that's where the seed is planted, and if they've been faithful, they'll continue to be faithful. I know that seed that I'm planting in their life is going to lead to something fruitful when I'm ready to reap a harvest from their life. It's about faithfulness in the small things consistently that leads to that big harvest of fruitfulness that we desire in our life. It's small, regular, consistent disciplines. It's regular and intentional attention. It's about priorities and practices and boundaries and habits. It's about these little things that nobody thinks about. It's about the little things that nobody sees. It's about what is done in secret that God rewards when He's ready and when it is time. And we don't decide the time. We decide every day that I'm going to trust Him. We decide every day God is faithful, God is good, God is sovereign, God has rescued me from death and raised me to life. God has given me His Spirit that's alive in me so I don't have to live as a slave to sin. I don't have to be crushed by the weight of temptation in my own life. But I can actually live with the life of Christ in me. And because of all that He's already done, pretty big things, I'm going to do the small things regularly. I'm going to spend time in His Word so that I can grow in the knowledge of Him. I'm going to spend time in prayer so that I can strengthen a relationship with Him. I'm going to spend time abiding and remaining and being faithful in His presence so that I can become more like Him, so that my life will be the kind of fertile soil that He can use, so that I'll feel that difference in my own life, but even more than that, so that my life can make a difference in the lives of others. We cannot make anything bear fruit, but we can engage some best practices for faithfulness. And I wonder about that in your life. If you think, man, I want that fruit, are you doing the small things every day consistently that would lead to the big things that you desire somewhere down the road. It's about the small intentional actions, about developing those kind of practices, about living consistently with that kind of surrender that God looks at you and says, man, I know that this person is a faithful steward of everything that I have entrusted to them. I know that this is a man or a woman of character that I can trust, that I can depend upon, that I know if I plant the seed in their life that they're going to cultivate that soil, they're going to pay attention to it, they're going to do everything that they can. They know that they're not the ones who are going to produce the fruit. They know that I'm going to produce the fruit, but I produce the fruit when they live faithfully, and I can trust them to do that. God decides when it's time to produce a harvest of fruitfulness. We looked at this verse during the heroic series, but I want to glance at it again in Galatians chapter 6. It says this. It says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Let's break this down. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. He's like, hey, this isn't like an idea that I have. This isn't like a suggestion. This isn't a general observation that I've made about the universe. This is a universal truth that there's no shortcut for and there's no workaround for. A man reaps what he sows. He says, man, your inputs are going to control your outputs. In fact, he doesn't say it here, but I think it's true. We worry so much about the outputs, fruitfulness, that we forget about the inputs of faithfulness. He says, stop looking at the outputs and shift it to the beginning of the process where you look at the inputs. I started thinking about life, and life is filled with us looking at the finish lines that we want to accomplish and the false starts that we make because we're looking at the finish line and we're forgetting about the faithfulness that it takes day by day. Pastor Tim, what are you talking about? I'm talking about I want to run across the finish line of the marathon and know I just ran 26.2 miles. I don't care how fast it is. I don't need to win the race. I just want to accomplish it. So you know what I got to do? If I want to get to the finish line, I got to start. So I'm going to get some running shoes and I'm going to go out and I'm going to run a mile. And you go out and you run a mile and you're like, oh man, that was terrible. And then the next day it rains. And then you realize, okay, I ran a mile. Now I'm going to try to run 2 miles. And you're like, running 2 miles is even worse than running 1 mile. And then it snows and it's shut down for a week. And you're like, I guess I'll never run a marathon. I'm talking about like the New Year's resolution that you made, where you were like, at the end of this year, I'm not going to smoke anymore. I'm not going to eat chips after 9 p.m. Like, that sounds kind of specific. It is kind of specific, all right? I'm not going to, whatever the thing is. You're like, January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, yeah, I'm crushing this. And then you have like a bad day, and you do the thing that you said you weren't going to do, and you get discouraged. And then you do it again the next day, and the next day, and you're like, well, 3 days, that's better than last year. It's the finish lines and the false starts. The transformation is actually in the faithfulness. It's the faithfulness. It's what we sow every single day of our lives that leads to what we're going to reap from our lives. And honestly, some of us are reaping stuff in our life, and we're like, man, this is lousy. I don't know why this is happening. Well, that's happening because it's the byproduct of what you've sown into your life over and over and over again, regularly and consistently, unintentionally, without discipline. It leads to bad results. But intentional attention, specific habits and disciplines and practices, establishing priorities that say, God is first in my life. I will live my life pursuing Him. I will live my life to honor Him. I will live my life in a way that I have a desire to know Him more so that I can live more like Him. I will be faithful in the small things every single day. And as I'm faithful in the small things, I'm going to trust God with the fruitfulness that I desire at the finish line. And one day I'm going to be surprised because I was faithful, 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 fruitful. Whoa, look at that. All I did was the same thing I did yesterday and the day before and the day before and the day before and the week before and the month before and the year before and the decade before. And where did it take me? Fruitful. And I was like, man, this would have been so much better if I could have been like, fruitful. It doesn't work that way. Our camera people, like, I'm either not in frame or they're like, stinking jerk. Faithful to fruitful. Faithful. 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 Bad day. Mistake. Setback. Faithful. 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 Fruitful. What did I do to be fruitful? Not much. But I did not much for a long time. I did it regularly, consistently, and intentionally, and it led me to the fruit that God wants to produce in my life. A man or a woman, they reap what they sow. So what are you reaping? And if what you're reaping isn't what you desire, if it's not the fruitfulness that you long for, what would happen if you rewound and looked at the things that you were sowing and asked, is this the faithfulness that God is calling me to all day, every day? I talk about day by day. We talk about hour by hour. What if we broke this down so that it was like decision by decision, moment by moment, second by second? I get to decide if I sow faithfulness and surrender and trust into my life, or if I sow unfaithfulness and pride and a lack of faith into my life. The more often I say yes to Him, the more fully I'm surrendered to Him, the more I trust in Him, the more I move towards the fruitfulness that He desires in my life. And eventually, when He decides it's time, and He will decide that it's time later than you think He should. I mean, they say that God is, He's rarely early, He's never late, and He's always on time. That's not because you pick what time. It's because His timing is perfect. And He calls you to trust in His timing and be faithful in the process. And here's the thing. Faithfulness, it doesn't get a lot of attention because nobody sees the faithfulness, but everybody sees the fruitfulness. In fact, sometimes, like if you are fruitful in something in your life, people will be like, how did you do that? How did you get there? How did you come to that place in your life? And nobody wants to hear, well, it took me 30 years, and I was really disciplined, like laser focus, like ninja intensity on it every day, and it got me there. And they were like, is there like a TED Talk that I could watch? Or like a magic metabolism pill that I could take? Like, Bo's getting results in his life. People are like, dude, what's up with your workout? He's like, I was at the gym for 4 hours on Saturday. And you were like, good for you, man. Good for you. Because we don't want to put in the work to get the results sometimes. But it's not that Bo did anything crazy to get there. He just kept doing it. Well, he went to the gym for 4 hours yesterday. That is kind of crazy. But it's about the faithfulness in the day to day. You might be faithful outside the spotlight for all of your life. In fact, church, I'm not sure how this holds up, but Dr. Lindstrom and Dr. Joel Coughlin are here, so they can let me know. You can be frustrated and faithful. In fact, I think it takes more faith to be frustrated. Because when you don't see the fruit, when you think you should see the fruit, it creates this feeling of weariness. It creates this discouragement. Maybe that's why Paul says, let us not become weary in doing good. Let's be faithfully frustrated and work through that frustration and continue to trust in the faithfulness of God, knowing that at the proper time we will reap a harvest. How? If you don't quit. Just don't give up. You just keep trusting. You keep thinking, man, I thought it was time. But I know He's got it in His time, and I know His timing is perfect, and I know He's got it under control. Fruitful. So, again, faithful, 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 faithful. Oh, man. Faithful, 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 frustrated. Faithful, 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 so frustrated. Fruitful. And man, you might be at frustration point right now, and I would just say, don't quit. Don't stop. Don't give up. Some of you haven't done it long enough to get frustrated anyways. So I would say, man, get going, get started. Let's get moving. Don't quit or don't sit around wherever you're at in the spectrum. Faithfulness leads to fruitfulness. And I think a lot of the faithfulness never gets the kind of praise and attention that it deserves. In fact, this might not be the encouraging message that you want to hear. It's possible that you could be faithful your whole life and not see the fruit of it. Get to the very end of it, faithful, 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 frustrated, frustrated, faithful, faithful. Hey, God, this is kind of the end. This is where the fruitfulness should be. And rather than seeing the fruit, you just hear, well done, good and faithful servant. And you know what? That's okay. That's enough. That maybe you don't ever see the fruit of your life, but maybe everybody else will see the small thing that you did for so long that actually made a difference in their lives. I was talking with somebody just this morning. I don't want to embarrass them. But they said, I made a decision 11 years ago that I was going to reorder some priorities in my life. And a month ago, my brother came to me and he said, I see the difference that you made. And you are a man of your word. And you were right about that thing. 10 years of faithfulness to get to that moment of fruitfulness. And I don't know about you. I don't know how long it's going to take. My guess is that there won't be a lot of celebration along the way for your faithfulness from those around you. But is that the reward we really want? Like, do we really need our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers cheering us on all the time? Or could we actually embrace the idea that we live our lives for an audience of one, and that the one is actually the one who makes it fruitful when he says it is time? He says it's okay if you're out of the spotlight. It's okay if nobody else sees it. It's okay if nobody else celebrates it. This is the part of the sermon from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. There's these three things that Jesus talks about. And they're kind of core practices for these Jewish people. This is kind of how their religion is defined. It's defined by the way that they give, the way that they pray, and the way that they fast. These are the external signs for the world. And so because that's how everybody kind of measures it, when you give to the poor, you make a really big deal about it. When you give to the church, you make a really big deal about it. And when you pray, you try to pray like really big spiritual prayers. And when you fast, like you want to look really miserable when you fast so everybody knows how spiritual you are. And Jesus is like, that's kind of over. That doesn't impress God. Like, if God was Shania Twain, and that's a stretch, he would say, come on, church, that don't impress me much. But this is what he actually says. He says, when you give, give in secret. When you pray, pray in private. When you fast, just make it between you and God. And there's this one verse that's just repeated in verse 4, in verse 6, and in verse 18. It says, when your Father sees what is done in secret, he will reward you. And then we just have to decide, is that the reward that we want? And we don't decide when the reward comes. It's not like the paycheck, like I worked 2 weeks and I got my paycheck. I worked 2 weeks and I got my paycheck. Like, I don't know when the paycheck is going to hit your bank account. That's a terrible metaphor because that sounds like prosperity gospel. I don't know when you're going to reap the harvest of faithfulness, but I promise you, faithfulness leads to fruitfulness. And if you're faithful with what God has called you to be, what God has called you to do, who God has called you to be, how he has called you to live, if you're faithful in that, eventually it leads to the fruitfulness that only he can provide in your life. Would you stand with me? We're going to pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for these folks. I love them, and I know that you love them even more. I know that the desire of their lives is that they would live lives that are fruitful, lives that make an impact, lives that make a difference to the world around them. And so, Lord, this week I pray that you would lead us and you would guide us to be faithful in the small things, to trust you